Good afternoon, everyone. It's Wednesday. Hope you're doing well. I hope your week has been good to you so far. I know wherever we go, whatever day of the week it is, Creator's always with us. Creator is good to us. So we just want to take a moment before we officially get started and just give a shout out, give a thank you, extend gratitude towards Creator for the gift of this life. It felt like a spring day earlier here in Amiskwaciy, Waskagan, here in Edmonton. I feel like the clouds are coming in. There might be a storm brewing, but it definitely feels like a beautiful summer day. And even with the rain, we need that water. Water's life. The land needs the water. So we're thankful for whatever season, for whatever comes in our day, we're thankful. So we give thanks to Creator and all of the gifts that have been given to us, all of our relatives, the animals, the plants, the sacred waters, our family and our friends, all of those good gifts. So just taking a moment to honor Creator. We take a moment to honor those who've walked before us, who've paved the path, who trailblazed so that we could do our work, we could do our job, we could do our calling in a good way. So we thank those ancestors and those people who've walked before us. So Creator, we give you thanks for the gift of this time that we have together. So welcome to Innovate BC. We're honored, glad you're here. We're super honored for our guest speaker, Koren Lightning-Earle. She actually had joined us probably 4 months ago, 3 months ago. And it was dynamic. It was encouraging. It was enlightening. It was informative. She's talking about Indigenous law and economic development. So an excellent, amazing topic today. So there will be time at the end of today's presentation, and we always love to hear from you. We always love to hear from the circle. So there will be time for any conversation, any questions at the end of today's presentation. But feel free along the way, if you have any questions or any comments from what you've heard, please use that chat box and I will make note of them. I will bring them up in our conversation at the end. So thank you for being here, everybody. We honor your presence. So I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker. Just as I'm looking at her bio right now, and it is stacked. She is a Cree from Samson Cree Nation. She is a legal director at Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge, which I got to hear from some of your colleagues actually last week, and they were remarkable. They're so smart. I guess you all have to be smart to do the work that you do there. Koren is the vice president of, I'm going to go for it, Kasohkowew, I feel like I failed, Child Wellness Society, and a board member for the First Nations Caring Society. She is acting commissioner for Alberta Utilities Commission. She is board member for Peace Hills Insurance. She was the Indigenous Initiatives Liaison at the Law Society of Alberta. She was the president of the Indigenous Bar Association for 6 years. Like, this list, let me tell you, could go on and on. She graduated from law school in 2007 at the University of Alberta. She was called to the bar in February 2009 and had the honor of having her bar call on her reserve of Samson Cree Nation. We love to hear that. She was called by Chief Justice Wahkotowin and Federal Court Justice Mandaman. I'm sorry if I said those names wrong. Koren, she received her Master of Law from Uskud Hall Law School, York University, and her concentration was alternative dispute resolution. Okay, so I just want to say, so this is a powerhouse in our midst today. And I know I could go on and on because there's so much more goodness to her bio, but I want to take up her time. Like, she is here. We're honored that she had carved out space to be here. So what today's topic is about Indigenous law. And so we're going to learn how can we support Indigenous communities in advancing economic development and revitalize Indigenous laws. So our guest speaker is here to just talk to us, enlighten us. She's going to talk about how she engages with Indigenous communities through community-led research. And that's what it's all about. It's all about the people. It's all about the community and listening to that voice. So Wahkotowin Lodge supports Indigenous communities' goals to identify, articulate, and implement their own laws and governments. I am so honored that you are here, Koren. So I'm going to pass this virtual mic to you. We are honored and we are proud of you. Proud of, that you are also blazing trails out there as well for our young people. So thank you for following your path, honoring the call that's on your life. So thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a really amazing introduction. I'm like, whew. So thank you very much. My name is Koren Lightning-Earle, and I'm from Samson, Cree Nation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm zooming in from Treaty 6 territory, where I'm thankful to be able to work and live in my own treaty territory. You must have met my students last week. So my research assistants and my articling student, I sent them to that youth conference because I'm all about building capacity and building people up so that they can go and do some of this great work. And so I was very excited for them to go, and they really loved that workshop. They had a lot of fun. And so I work for Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge. I am the legal director there. And so I'm just going to go like this. And so I'm the legal director at the Law and Governance Lodge, and we're a research unit based out of the University of Alberta, Faculty of Law, and we do research and we work with Indigenous communities. And we're so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do and how it relates to economic development. You're like, how does law relate to economic development? And I'm going to tell you how we try to partner with communities. And so the purpose of the lodge is we are there to support Indigenous communities to identify and implement their own laws and governance practices. We develop, gather, and we amplify, and really amplifying transfer wise practices. We use promising methods, and we have different research tools that we use in the work that we do. We believe in producing accessible, practical governance resources and public legal education. Because if it's not accessible by people that are going to be using it, then what's the point of it? So many times I talk to people and they're like, oh, we have this document that this lawyer drafted for us, but we don't understand it. So I believe in writing information and laws for people that are actually going to be using them and reading them and implementing them, and people that it affects. So our tagline is upholding Indigenous laws and governance. We've responded, we were built and created out of a dream and out of recommendation from the TRC call to action number 50, so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so we'll get into a little bit about that. And really that call was to develop Indigenous law institutes for the development, use, and understanding of Indigenous laws. So our principles of how we govern ourselves at the lodge is we use the principles of Wahkotowin and Wahkotowin in how we govern our relationships with people, and how we govern our relationships with communities, and guide the work that we do with Indigenous communities, and how we support Indigenous communities, because we do have this belief that we're all connected, and it only in the first 5 minutes of most conversations we have with communities, we figure out how they know who I am or I know who they are, and we figure out how we're all connected, because that's what the first 5 minutes is. Our grounding principles that we believe at Wahkotowin Lodge and how we approach the work that we do and with communities, and not just Indigenous communities, but also the legal community of Canada. And we believe that Indigenous laws need to be treated seriously as laws, just as you would follow a traffic law, just as you would follow a criminal law or criminal code or a property bylaw. We believe Indigenous laws have the same value, if not more, and they should be treated as such, as laws, and engaged with as laws. Indigenous law research should be conducted with the highest standard of rigor and transparency. So we do believe in doing very thorough, and our research is held to a very high standard in the work that we do. And sometimes when we're working with community, we're like, just hold on, it's not ready yet. We want to make sure that we get it right and that we get it done properly. Indigenous laws are just one aspect of Indigenous governance, but it's part of a comprehensive of a whole society. And so it's one aspect. It's kind of one of, if you were to think about the branches of Canada and the legislature, there's the different branches, but we believe that Indigenous laws is a part of those. Revitalizing Indigenous laws and governance process is essential and a requirement, I would say, to rebuild healthy communities and for reconciliation in Canada. A lot of people get confused about what is Indigenous law and what is Aboriginal law. So Aboriginal law, if you hear someone saying, I practice Aboriginal law, or Aboriginal law is judge-made law. It's Aboriginal people and the Crown or versus the Crown. So it's cases like Delgamuukw, Blueberry River, all of those consultation cases, anything that comes from a colonial lens with a colonial perspective with colonial laws behind it is Aboriginal law. That affects Aboriginal people. Whereas Indigenous laws are rooted in Indigenous societies and Indigenous legal orders. Indigenous laws are, if you were to think of common law and civil law in Canada, there's also Indigenous law. Indigenous law is a legal order. It is just like common law and civil law. And so again, we treat it as such. And so practicing Indigenous law is a little bit different than practicing Aboriginal law, because you can't be like, I follow Indigenous law every day and I support Indigenous communities in writing their Indigenous laws. Well, I practice it probably with my children is the best way that I could describe it, but I follow and I practice it in terms of how I live my life. Whereas some people can be working with Indigenous laws, but not necessarily practicing it. They're not from that community. So different ways to think about it. Indigenous societies had laws. I always say that prior to colonialism, Indigenous people, and I firmly believe we were here and we were doing our thing and we were living our lives. We were not just running amok. A lot of people had mentioned to me, well, how did they have ways of interacting with other societies? Did they have procedures of diplomacy, like international procedures? I said, yes, we did. We had ways of interacting with other societies. We had ways of interacting with each other. We had values and principles in our own laws. It just didn't look like what laws looked like to those that came over the seas when they came over. And it didn't look like what they decided was going to be the supreme law. And so, but we did have law. We had societies. We had a way of being. Indigenous law doesn't have to look like Western law. Indigenous laws John Burroughs is a amazing academic. He's like, we have like John Burroughs and Val Napoleon, like the grandmother and the grandfather of some of this work that we do, who are some of our idols in the way that they talk about laws. And so John Burroughs wrote that Indigenous laws derive from them having been practiced and passed down through elders, families, clans, or bodies. Indigenous laws continue to be recorded in various forms, including stories, song, practices, and customs. So Indigenous laws are there. They're living all around us. Indigenous laws, again, it's not Aboriginal law, and it's not restorative justice. It's not Aboriginal courts or healing programs. Those are programs and processes that are for having maybe some Indigenous values, but the concept and the core is still working through those colonial laws. Restorative justice is still an Indigenous, like a process for Indigenous people that's working out the colonial laws, working out the criminal law system in a process that doesn't look like a court, in a different process, but it's not necessarily going through the values and principles of Indigenous law. Indigenous laws can be ancient, they can be deeply rooted, they can be sourced in the earth. We see that every day, some of the work we're doing. We see it in springtime as the things are going out. We see it when we're going out onto the land, when we're going to go fishing or hunting, or even just when we're going to go out and do gathering, and how we interact with each other, the world, and animals. Indigenous laws can be recent, they can be drafted as treaty, agreements, bylaws, even legislation, and they can have elements of Indigenous legal traditions and other sources of law. Indigenous laws Indigenous people have evolved. We've evolved from pre-colonialism to now, and we've evolved and we've adapted and move forward. And so our laws can do just the same. Our laws are not frozen in time. We can move and adapt, and they can look like whatever we decide them to look like. There's an article written by Val Napoleon Friedland and Hadley Friedland, and The reference is at the bottom, and it talks about how the 4 eras of Indigenous laws. And I think about this as the 4 eras of Indigenous people in terms of where we're at in this revitalization of laws and really coming into that sovereignty of our communities and building up our communities. And some are more advanced on this and some are still a little behind, really depending on your resources, can depend on where your community fits into this. But if we think about it like the roots to Renaissance, so 1,000+ years ago, there was groups of people, there was law. And then about 100 to 400 years ago is when people started coming over the seas and interacting with Indigenous people here. And so there was this repression of what we had, this repression of Indigenous people, of their laws, of their way of being. It was repressed and overcome with the visitors that came over. But there was also a little bit of resilience there. It wasn't all lost. It wasn't all lost because we fought back in many ways. We fought back by not sending our kids to residential school. We fought back by continuing to have our ceremonies, but just farther in the bush where the Indian agent couldn't get. We continue to fight back by continuing to be resilient and live and strive for strength and continuing to pass forward our teachings from generation to generation. And then about 10 to 40 years ago is when we started to see this recovery and this resilience. And what happened about 40 years ago? Oh, we were allowed to go to university. The Indian Act was changed, so we were allowed to leave our reserves. And that's maybe 60 years ago now, but it wasn't until the 60s or 70s that we were even allowed to think about going to law school. Or even to think about being able to hire a lawyer, or thinking about how are we going to be sovereign. So those things weren't allowed for a very long time, and it wasn't until they were allowed we were able to start kind of breaking out of our spaces and creating more space for people and advancing our communities. And then about 1 to 10 years ago, we start to see this resurgence and this renaissance, where we see communities really enhancing their own communities and values. Because a lot of time before that, it was non-Indigenous lawyers coming and helping communities develop laws. And that's great. But sometimes those laws don't look like us. They don't seem like us. It might just be a similar municipal bylaw from somebody, or an election law that was brought from the Indian Act, but we didn't see it within us because it was people coming in and learning, but we still just didn't see that resurgence. Now we know that there's this resurgence coming. We've had the TRC find a report. We've had other reports. We have communities that are winning. We're winning, people. We're winning at the Supreme Court. Our rights are being asserted and so we're seeing a turnover. We're seeing a resurgence. We're seeing a movement moving forward of us being able to stand up and kind of push against what's trying to hold us back. So Indigenous laws, they're not declarations, they're not positions. They can be principles and processes. They're deliberation or debate. And sometimes when you talk to people, there's never a hard and fast rule. It's always there's principles and values behind why we do X and Z. But there's never really a hard and fast yes or no. You ask an elder something, I ask my late dad something, I would never just get a yes or no. I'd always get a teaching or something about the principles and how I lead my life and how I come to that decision. And so those are things that we can think about. Indigenous laws can be used in implicit or informal ways. They can even be damaged. If we look at that roots to Renaissance and we look at that timeline, we can see all of that damage, that repression. And when we research, we're not always going to come out exactly what it looked like when we were pushed down. And so sometimes that resurgence is going to come up, and sometimes they can be damaged, those laws. They can be unevenly understood, and they can even be mistrusted. And if we think about what people have gone through, and sometimes what's happened to them and how they've kind of gone through this world, they could even mistrust those Indigenous laws based on their experiences and their own personal beliefs. Indigenous laws can be shared in ways that are not familiar to legal professionals. I was in a meeting once and we had this whole presentation, and by the end of the presentation, I said, did you know that we had to follow 4 Indigenous laws in this hour that I was talking? There was 4 things that I had to do. The Indigenous people in the crowd immediately kind of started to think about, okay, yes, she did this, she did that. And the non-Indigenous people maybe didn't understand, but that's okay. It was just introducing them to the concept that our laws might not be familiar to you, and they might not be easily recognizable to you. Indigenous laws are rarely recognized, they're rarely resourced. There's not a lot of funding for this type of thing. There's lots of funding to do economics and all of these things, and do some oil and gas and all of these things in industry. But when you essentially want to say, I would like to draft a law, there's not a lot of funding for that. And we have basic needs that some of our communities need to actually deal with first. And they're not enforced adequately. Criminal law is enforced. We have RCMP, we have our own police forces on reserve, but there's that gap in that other area. Some, like, if we call it, that civil law, but how do we enforce them? Even in Indigenous law, how do we enforce them? And what does that enforcement even look like? So there's an article by Brene and Stephen Troop, and it talks about how the hard work of law is never done. And so Indigenous laws is something that we work on all the time. I think I've been working since 8 o'clock this morning, and I'll continue to work today till probably later in the evening. And Indigenous laws are living, adapting, changing, and developing, like all laws. Laws in Canada aren't just made and then it's done. They're adapted and moving forward. So sometimes we see law as this brick wall. We see law as this brick wall because sometimes it doesn't look like us. It feels like it's holding us back, or it's holding us from something else. And it's not warm, and it's not a feeling that seems natural to us. But John Burroughs argued that law can be like this river. It can be something that is always changing and adapting to the environment around it. Law is like that. Indigenous laws are living. They're not like that brick law. They're more like that river. Indigenous legal traditions are uplifting. They're positive, liberating forces when they're connected to living systems of thought and practice. The TRC final report found that it came out with several things, and I don't know how many people have read the TRC report. I have it here if you want to borrow it, but it is online free. And I always tell people, if you can, just read the first 100 pages. And I tell my students that too. And then they're like, no, but it's important because it talks about a lot of things. But one of the things that it does says at 206, so if you want to get into the deep stuff, go into the 200s, it says Aboriginal people must be able to recover, learn, and practice their own distinct legal traditions. And then at 213, it says, establishing respectful relations, so this whole reconciliation word that we like to toss around, requires the revitalization of Indigenous laws. And the commissioners for the Truth and Reconciliation, 2 of them were lawyers. And they were some of the first people that were out of the gates to become lawyers. And they heard the stories of people day in and day out. And they came up with these recommendations. And they really believed in them. And they were saying they are calls to action. Really, they're calls to action to each and every one of us people that live on Turtle Island, because we can't live in bubbles. We can't live in silos where we're not working together with each other. We're not going to get to where we need to be without working together. And one of the Justice Murray Sinclair said, it took us 7 generations to get here. And so if we look at that 7 generations, and if we look at that roots to Renaissance and that path of where the repression started, where we are, he said it's going to take us 7 generations to get back to something normal. So I would say we're in about the 2nd or 3rd generation. My children are the 1st generation to not have to attend residential school. So that's like the 1st generation, and it's 2022. So we're going to get there. And so some of the things that the TRC said about Indigenous laws is number 40, call to action number 42. And this is where Indigenous laws need to be formally implemented, practiced, resources, enforced. We already know that the current system doesn't work for us. It's pretty obvious. And we know we had systems. So how do we revitalize those systems? Number 27 and 28. And this is to have legal education and continuing legal education to help those learn and engage with Indigenous laws. Because as we have this resurgence, we need to be able to teach other people how to engage with them. So we do that on the side too. So that's why I talk to you some education with a lot of people, especially with judges who are going to be kind of seeing some of these play into their own spaces. And then number 50, which is the space for Indigenous people to reconstruct and develop Indigenous laws. So Indigenous laws have been part of our court system. Justice Gramont is a federal court judge who's done a lot of work in this case. He's a very good ally, and he's very thoughtful in the work that he does. And so in Passion versus the Deneta, there's the court case. He says that Indigenous legal traditions are among Canada's legal traditions. They form part of the law of the land. And he quotes a case called Connolly versus Woolridge. He's saying that Canadian courts have recognized the existence of Indigenous legal traditions and had given effect to situations created by Indigenous law. And so the Connolly and Woolridge case is a funny case because it's a case of a marriage, and it's from 1867. So this is a long time ago. Connolly and Woolridge, it was a case where a non-Indigenous man married an Indigenous woman, and they got married under the Indigenous law of the community that she was from. So they got married they were legally married in the eyes of that community. They followed the laws of her community. And then he decided, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go marry I'm going to go back and marry a non-Indigenous woman. I'm going to get married in the common law. I'm going to go have a church wedding and sign all those papers. But the court found that he couldn't go marry the other person. He was still legally married to the Indigenous woman that he married, because his marriage was legal. He tried to say it wasn't legal, but it was legal in the eyes of the law at the time. So we have been talking about and recognizing Indigenous laws in the courts for some time now. Indigenous laws are a part of Canadian law. We see it increasingly in court cases. They're starting to being called into judges and courts lawyers are being asked to substantively engage with Indigenous laws from a range of sources. There was a case from BC, Haida case, where they said, we want to bring in, we would like to have this case heard in our community. And they said, well, I don't know if we can do that. And they said, okay, well, we're gonna bring. So what they did is they blew up a big pictures of the trees. Those trees on the coast are huge. They blew up a big picture of the trees, and the lawyer brought it in and she put it there and she said, well, you couldn't come to our community, so we wanted to show you that these trees, we wanted you to bring them to you, and we couldn't bring you to them, so we brought them to you in this form of these pictures. But we want you to see how big they are, how powerful they are, and these are our sisters. We have an obligation to these sisters. We have an obligation to these trees, and that's why we're here fighting this case. And this was at the Supreme Court. So they brought in this and they said, we want you to imagine what it's like to have obligations, because we have obligations and we have to fight for these trees, for our family. And so it was another way of bringing in Indigenous laws and bringing in sources to show the court and to show the people that law doesn't have to look like you. Law can look different and still be meaningful and still be valid. Indigenous laws come in various forms, and some are easy to see and some are not. The Canadian profession and judiciary are constantly needing to learn more and gain competencies. Most law societies across Canada are starting to create a form of competency requirement for Indigenous education. We're not even at Indigenous laws yet. We're just like, Indigenous people are real, and Section 35 of the Constitution, and here's some history. Just trying to give that basic information and then start to build on that. Because the reality is, not a lot of people that are past the age of 40 have had the proper education about Indigenous people in Canada. If we think back to way back when we were going to school, they were being taught the same things that we were being taught in residential school, was that we were less than, that we were not people, and that we weren't worthy of many things, that we didn't have laws, and that we needed to be assimilated. And that's what people were also being, non-Indigenous people were being taught. So it's really time to kind of start to change that narrative. Indigenous law resources can come from language. We've done a lot of work with communities on language bundles and how there's law in language, and how from one word we can derive so many principles and values from that, and how some words can have so much meaning. When we think about Wahkotowin and the principles and values behind Wahkotowin and what that means to us and the work that we do and our obligations and responsibilities to each other, the land is a resource, ceremony is a resource, There's implicit and informal practices that we can think of. And of course, stories and oral history. These have been starting to be, those were brought up in the case of Dalgamuk, the oral testimony and the oral history of the elders when they were coming in. Now we start to see other things. And if you remember when you were small, as children, we're always told stories. And as Indigenous people, that's how we taught our children about principles and values of how to act in certain situations. We all remember about learning about Waisagicha and the things we weren't supposed to do. Or we all have some sort of trickster in our community, in our Indigenous community. And what did those things teach us about different values and principles? The approach that we do when we're working with Indigenous communities is we have a broad. So again, we do the PLE resources, which is just public legal education, and anything that the community needs. It can be from economic development. It can be from, maybe this won't be election laws. That's always super fun. Membership issues, child welfare, and so starting to move it into the criminal law aspect. We have our website, we have some social media, we have a YouTube. We do not have TikTok. We are not that fancy yet. And we do presentations to communities and various groups, such as today. But just in terms of raising awareness and how can we have these conversations. We do a lot of judicial education. I do a lot of work with the TRC, and I do training in anti-racism, cultural humility, and Indigenous laws, and starting to get people to have a conversation. We curate and amplify wise practices because there's a lot of people out there that are doing amazing things. And so we want to be able to share that, and they want to be able to share it with other communities. So next week, I'm bringing, I don't even know, 27 people together to do some work on this, our approach that I'm talking about today on Indigenous laws and the research we do with communities. And they're coming together from all across Turtle Island so they can learn our process, but also connect with each other in the work that they're doing and build relationships with each other and figure out how to support and amplify what they're doing in their own communities. And we do a lot of one-to-one coaching. We advise supporting communities doing the work. So I get a lot of calls. Hey, I have a question for you. Or, hey, what do you think about this? And so that's something we're always open to, because it's not, sometimes there's not a lot of people out there that do some of the work that we're doing. And so we're always getting emails or getting phone calls. And then we have our major community-led research projects, and that's based on the needs of the community, depending on the nations that come forward and work with us. And those are very time and labor intensive, more so than we thought, actually. And so our community partnered research is community-led, and it's about what the community's goals and visions are for law and governance. We try to identify, and we start by identifying and building on our existing strengths, because we find so many, when we're working with communities, they have so much richness there already. And sometimes they just need someone to come in and show them and help them unearth that and just take an inventory of what they have in the community, whether it's people, resources, books, so many things. But just kind of doing that scan of what they already have and saying, look, these are all the amazing things you have in your community that will help us toward your goals and vision for whatever law that you want to develop. We take a holistic approach to complex issues. We were brought into communities, and we're able to kind of support. We're really good at leading conversations, especially on complex issues, in a way that where everybody feels supported, where people feel valued. We provide training and support to community leaders and workers. We use our various methods. There's a narrative analysis method, linguistic, and a kinship visiting methods. And that's how we do our research, depending on what the community needs are. So if there's a community that just wants to do like a community, say if somebody wanted to do a community plan where they're like, actually, we would like to really develop a law around gaming. Maybe we want to develop a law around trade, whatever it be, or child welfare, whatever it is, depending on what it is. We practice all these things, and people might say, oh, did we have any principles and values around trade? We sure did. And some communities, when they created treaty, made sure they put that in there. So if you look at some of our peace and friendship treaties from our friends on the East Coast, they have that in there. They have in their treaty small things that can be interpreted to have that trade. And so we did have values of trade and commerce. Just how do we get down to that? And so we have methods of how to get to those principles and values of whatever it is the community needs. And it might just be visiting with elders. There might be specific methods that we use, but we use a variety of methods based on legal academics that have created these methods and written about it. We engage the whole community. We believe that everybody has wisdom, and we need everybody's wisdom for the widest result. And so when we go into communities and we do these things called wisdom workshops, where we're just helping a community just articulate what their goals and visions are. And they're like, oh, we just want this committee. Like, okay, is there other people? Oh, maybe we'll bring in some youth. Maybe we'll bring in some elders. And anybody that comes has value. And we want everybody to have value and have that voice. So we're able to do that in a way with some of our methods. And again, developing that clear language governance and public legal education resources. And if the community wants, finding ways to get it translated into their own language is really important too. Our CommunityLed Research, we have formal agreements called research partnership agreements, and we have an ethics process if people want to, because sometimes there's a lot of research that goes on in community or partnerships, and people maybe don't know how it impacts them or impacts the intellectual property, or who's going to keep these survey, where is this information going to be stored, who has the rights to it, and who owns it. And so we made sure we have agreements that ensure that ownership stays with the community, so that people also feel safe when they're sharing information with us. You can only imagine the conversations that are had around even membership. And people might want to say things, but how do we get their information and ensure that it's shared in a way that protects them too? And that's done in an ethical way. And so some communities have their own ethical practices, and we make sure we follow those. But we always want to make sure that it's community-led and the community is protected. And that especially includes the intellectual property. And then we have an Indigenous research methods for revitalizing Indigenous laws and governance training course. It's a mouthful because we couldn't figure out how to say it in a short way. And this is a course that we're actually doing next week. We're just launching our summer research program. And so all of our communities come together, and communities who have been thinking about what they want to do, they can come and we try to teach them. We do train the trainer, and we just get them to start to come together and understand the concepts of Indigenous laws, how they can engage with them, and some practice methods, and discuss together. And then we try to help them along their way when they're developing their laws, whichever it may be. And the process sometimes takes a long time. We thought we would do the 6-step process in 4 months last year. No, it could be almost a year process just to get to number 4. So depending on where you are and where communities are, it can take a long time. It can be very quick, but we do that inventory, and then we identify and select which methods will work. And then we have a research plan, and then we implement the research itself. And step number 4 is really the intensive part. Number 2 and 3, number 1 and 2, they're not the fun parts. People are like, let's go through this, let's get this done. But sometimes it takes a long time to get that work done, to really go find what the resources are. And then number 5 is we do analysis, and we do a final report, and then we decide what's next. So there was one community that wanted a membership. They wanted to talk about membership. And so they went through all of those steps. They got the analysis and the final report. And the next steps, what they wanted is they wanted to start moving to legislative drafting. So what they did was they gave me the report and all of the research and said, here you go. Can you create a membership law draft from this? And I was able to create something for them that looked like them. It had things that were specific to their community. I couldn't just take another membership law, copy and paste, and put their name in it. I had to take it and take the law and make it so it looked like, because they had different values around what they wanted to do, how they wanted to engage membership, and what was important to them. And then I gave it back to them, and they were like, okay, this is a good start. And then they were able to take it to their legal counsel and say, okay. And I had mentioned there's a couple things you still need to think about. Like it's not all said and done. There's still some more community conversations that need to be had around certain topics. And so that's where they went. And sometimes it can be different projects, targeted community engagement, whatever it looks like for the communities. Some of the challenges that we have with Indigenous laws and doing the work that we do is that it's the challenges of accessibility, intelligibility, applicability, and legitimacy. Because we are in such this long state of repression, again, we see this unevenness, and then people thinking, is this law valid? Is it intelligible? And then how do we make it accessible? Unenforceability is a huge thing because lack of funding to formally develop these types of laws. If people are just trying to figure out how to get clean drinking water, how are they supposed to even think about developing a law? And the educational gaps within our communities and between communities is another challenge. This slide is really skinny, but I hope I need to make it so it's bigger. But the multiple methods that we use together, usually sometimes singularly, sometimes one, sometimes we jump, sometimes I'm in the moment and I'm in a community and I'm like, okay, we're going to do the narrative analysis method, and we're going to talk about stories and work through these stories. And then I get there and we're going through it, and then by the lunchtime, we've changed into the visiting method. No more stories. We're going to go into this method. So being adaptable is something that we really try to do. If land-based learning, we're going out and we're going to learn about law from a community on just learning about law through tide tanning. And what are the implications behind that? And what are the laws around tanning hide in terms of our relation to each other and the community? The story-based method, relational governance method, and kinship visiting. So all of these different methods, and the name of the sides are just academics that have done a lot of this work in terms of drawing out these methods of how we can revitalize Indigenous law. And so giving back to the community is a huge thing for us because we believe in training people from the community. We don't want to come in and be an extraction society. We want to come in and plant seeds, whether it's through training, whether I convince somebody there to go to law school or whatever it may be. We want to be able to give back to the communities because it's about lifting them up, and we're just there to just be the support and the helpers in doing that work. Ongoing coaching and advising. We usually give them a final report, which includes the research process, various methods, the survey results, recommendations for next steps. And sometimes the report's very lengthy. One of my students just finished one and it's like 80 pages. And I said, this is fantastic, but now we need a shorter summary for it to be accessible to people to be able to read it that just want to read the first part. And then if they want to read the 80-page wonderful research paper that you wrote, they can, but not a lot of people want to read 80 pages of research. So I'm like, let's condense it and draw out the important things. And so they were like, okay. Possible drafting legislation or drafting instructions, just even drafting instructions on what they get taught, tell their lawyer that they need. We do community written, approved, or co-written publications. Again, it's about amplifying those voices. If we're able to create video resources for them, then we're able to do that. We have a couple that we're going to be releasing over the next couple months. If you follow our Facebook or our Twitter, we'll be showcasing those, whatever it can to help the community. So that's my presentation, just talking about the work that we do and how does that relate to Indigenous laws. It's the work, how we can help revitalize those. We're always looking to work with communities or talk to people about how can this work in an economic development way. And I think it definitely could. If it can work, it doesn't just need to work in those child welfare, criminal law, and it can work in environmental realms. It can work in economic realm too. We did have ways of society, of economic in our society. It'd be interesting to take a look at what that looks like for some communities. Some it might be very clear, and some might just need to do a little bit of research. But yeah, thank you very much for having me. There's my contact information. I'm pretty sure if you Google me, I'm very easy to find. If I don't respond, it just means just send me another message. There's our Twitter and our Facebook. And then we do have our website. We have a YouTube. If you go on YouTube and you just Google Wahkotowin Law and Governance Lodge, you'll find our channel with a couple resources that we have. I'm always looking to build more. So I was able to get that done and have some time for questions.
You sure did. I mean, you stirred I come from, my background is really community engagement and community development. And so, I think even this presentation was wrapped in community. Like I heard this saying, it's not my own, but I heard this saying like, months ago, saying not about us, without us. And it's all about, that community. And I loved what you said about, everybody in that community has wisdom, and part of what you're doing is unearthing it. And I loved that. And everybody has value, everybody has some sort of contribution, and I just love that. I could go on, but we have some folks here, we have guests in our room. Does anyone have any question? I know Ken, you had a question which I will ask in a moment, but anybody, get ready if you have any questions. This is an excellent opportunity to ask Koren. One of Ken's questions was, does Aboriginal law always trump Indigenous law?
No. I would say not in my house. Because Aboriginal law is what is civil law and common law in the courts versus Indigenous people. I would say that's a field. It's not a thing. Whereas Indigenous law is legal principles. It's a legal order. Aboriginal law is just case law regarding Indigenous people. Whereas it's still common law and civil law. So I wouldn't say it trumps it, but I would say there's a specifically amount of cases recently that have been going to the Supreme Court, where they've been bringing in elements of Indigenous law to argue against common law and civil law, because the people that are arguing those laws are Indigenous lawyers, or lawyers that are really amazing allies that are working with Indigenous laws and fighting and getting the interpretation of the issue to be decided based on Indigenous law, instead of deciding the issue based on common or civil law.
Okay, well, thanks for the clarification and the distinction. So what can you tell us a little bit? So you're the director of the Wahkotowin Lodge. And then do you also, so I imagine you have students, participants that you are on this journey together doing your thing in communities, but also do you still, sorry for the ignorance, but do you practice law? Do you still do that? Do you still have, can you talk a little bit about that? Like what's a day in the life of Koren?
Oh, it's a busy life. So I do the work that we do at the lodge at the university. And so I do have, I have our academic director, Dr. Hadley Freeland, who we basically work together. We're a team. Right now we're co-teaching a course. Right now on this very kind of topic. And then we have a manager, and then we're hiring a coordinator, really to keep us organized. And then we have I'm articling a student this year, which is it's like junior lawyering. It's like you have to article for a year before you become a lawyer once you graduate law school. So I'm supposed to be really mean and overwork them, but I'm not. So, and then I have research assistants, which we hire. We have 3 research assistants coming in, 2 of which are Indigenous. And so they're really vital in the work that we do, because we try to pair them when we're working with community. We try to pair them up with a research person from the community, again, so they can build relationships and kind of really just get some of the work done for us. So we try to train them up so that we're able to send them out to be able to do workshops and things for in the name of the lodge, and build them up too, because not every law job out there looks like what I get to do every single day, which is different every single day, but amazing. And then I do run a private practice between the hours of midnight and 2 a.m. No, just kidding. But I do run my own private practice, where I do work with some Indigenous communities in the areas I provide legal advice on areas of governance, Indian Act matters, and child welfare matters. I also do have that on the side. And then I also teach as a sessional at the law school and other things. I try to be a parent too sometimes.
Oh, so your plate is overflowing. Well, I mean, the fact that you can make time for us and to educate us and to inform us as to what you're doing. And I feel like this is just hopeful news. This is really good news that you brought. So you're on Facebook, you're on Twitter. I feel like, yes, you got to get on that TikTok. That's where life is happening. Not that you need more on your plate. So make sure you follow these folks and also the YouTube channel. I actually watched a video. Okay, so here's another question. Is it possible to simplify Indigenous laws, then fall back on basic principles? For example, the golden rule.
I would say no, because each Indigenous community is its own distinct society. So what happens in Cree law is very different than what would happen under Haida law or Mohawk law. So the principles and values that we might have around raising children could be very different, around commerce could be very different based on each society, just as common law is based on an English society and civil law on a French society. Each Indigenous community is own society, so there would be no pan-Indigenous idea of law. It would be distinct because we have so many distinct Indigenous communities in Canada. Each of them has their own principles and values.
Yeah, that's great. And that's what makes you unique, I believe, as well. Okay, so we have a couple moments. Does anyone have any questions or comments? We would invite you to the floor. Elise, can you tell us a bit more about some of the research or a case that you're working on? I love that question.
So some of the research that we're working on that we're allowed to talk about, again, it's up to communities if they let us know. So we're doing some work right now with some First Nations in Alberta on child welfare. So Bill C-92 came out. And so there's some communities that want to develop their own law, but they want to make sure that the law, the principles and values are based on tradition, on Cree or Dene principles regarding child and family. So what are the principles around that? What do the values look like that? And specifically for their own communities. And so once they get to go through that research phase where the community starts to look at some of the stories. So we looked at a lot of Cree stories. We looked at a lot of elder testimonies, and we're able to draw, that's where that 80-page report came from, on these Cree principles around what's the best interest of the child. That was the research question in that case. And so we sent it back to the community, and we're like, okay, so now we'll go back and do some community engagement, say, what does this look like? Are these Cree principles and values that we've researched, is this something that resonates with you? Does this look like you? And if they do, and the community engages and they're like, yes, then we would draft a law based on those values. And so then the next step would be the legal drafting. And so rather than, because right now with Bill C-92, there's a lot of push for Indigenous communities to get their own law. So there's lots of people that are drafting laws out there. They're like, here's a law, and it's like a cookie cutter law. But it's good, but it also sometimes doesn't look like communities, especially when you think about child welfare and some of the implications. How people, it's not something that people feel warm and fuzzy about. But we do have those Cree principles around what that would look like. So that's one project. Another project that we're working on after this, I'm going to a meeting with another international Indigenous community where they want to learn about how we're revitalizing our laws here in Canada. And then maybe they're going to see if we can go there and show them our methods. And then maybe they would be able to use those methods to revitalize their own Indigenous laws in their own community. And that's in South America. So those are some of the things we do. We're working with some communities on their own. They want to do like a big community strat plan. Like they want to develop laws, but they're just wondering, where do they begin? And so working with the community about what's important to the community, what do you want to see in law development, rather than just saying, here, we're going to do this law and this law and this law, really developing a big plan. And so that's what we did last year. And so this year we'll be going into that same community and saying, okay, let's focus in. And they really wanted to focus in on youth and get youth engaged in law development. And so that's kind of where that one might be going. So we get asked, we just got asked to do some work in maybe possibly Nunavut with their IQ principles. I can't pronounce the I word because it's in a word that I can pronounce. And how would we do some development in the IQ principles and getting that education out to the judiciary in Nunavut. So.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the insight and letting us kind of have a view as to what you're working on. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you. We see you. We see the strength, the voice that you are. I said at the very beginning that here's a powerhouse in our midst, and you are, paving trails. And so the fact that that's a testimony that another place is that, where did you say South America was like consulting with you? Like, I think that that's amazing. And that shows the strength of the work that you're doing, that other countries are consulting you and how they can make it work for their own. It's just a remarkable. So thank you so much. You're an inspiration. You're such a hope. So we'll continue to cheer you on and to do what you need to do, to strengthen our people and our community. So thank you so much. And thank you for being here. And all of you for joining. We just are so honored that you chose to be with us on this beautiful Wednesday afternoon. I hope you have a good rest of the day. And I hope that you continue to honor your path wherever Creator has called you to be, and to show up in the best way possible. So take care, be well, and I hope to see you again. Peace, everyone.